Welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. This program is A House Divided, and I am your host, Bjorn Skaptason. Welcome back to Author's Voice. Today we are talking about a fine book. Let me grab a copy of it right here. A fine collection of Civil War letters, This Infernal War. Comes to us from Kent State University Press. The cost is $38.95. Thank you to the publishers, Kent State University Press, for helping get author and editor Timothy Mason Roberts to us today. And let me introduce you to Timothy Mason Roberts. Welcome to Author's Voice, Tim.
Thank you, Bjorn. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, glad you're here. Now, if you're watching this program on Facebook Live, a lot of you are, because we've had a lot of really good success with Facebook Live. If you're watching this on Facebook Live, please use the comments section there in the feed to submit a question. If you're submitting your question over our website, include your name and where you're from so that we can shout out to you. We want to say hello to you. Most importantly, there's a reason why we're here. There's a reason why we're able to bring these programs to you at home. Live interviews with authors. It's because you buy the book. You buy the book. You want a fine, signed, first edition book for your library. So there's a link there, both on Facebook and, of course, if you're on our website, you can buy the book right there off the website. Buy the book. You'll get a signed copy. Tim will be happy to sign it for you. We will ship it out to you, and you'll get it at your home. So, hey, welcome to A House Divided. Our guest today, Timothy Mason Roberts, is professor of history at Western Illinois University in Macomb, Illinois. He's a teacher and scholar of the antebellum period and Civil War America. He's the author of Distant Revolutions, 1848 and the Challenge to American Exceptionalism. Also a co-editor of the 4-volume American Exceptionalism, and now the editor of This Infernal War, the Civil War Letters of William and Jane Standard. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, first of all, how did you meet Will and Jane Standard? Tell us the story of that.
It's really quite a remarkable story looking back. In 2011, I was in my office and was contacted by a man named Ron Currens, who lives in Atlanta. He is the great-great-grandson of William Standard. Ron's parents had lived in Macomb, and Ron actually grew up in Macomb. He had inherited the letters of William and Jane, about 225 letters from his mother. They had remained unpublished. Ron's mother, Dorothy, had attempted to have the letters published back in the 1930s, but publishers at the time were not interested, fortunately enough for me. Ron provided me a letter from an agent who said the letters lack drama, and the letters don't capture the exciting things of the war that readers would be interested in. So they passed at the time. I saw the value of these letters quickly, and I agreed to work on them with Ron. The letters had to be transcribed, and some had been typed out by his mother, but most were still handwritten. They were on microfilm. But then there was a real breakthrough. The Atlanta History Center digitized the letters, and it made them much more legible and really made the completion of the editing project possible. I was drawn to them. They're local people. They're from Lewiston, Illinois, about 30 miles from where I live. He joined the military in 1862, and so there was a real local flavor for me. The other point that's really intriguing for me, of course, is it's a correspondence. You get not only what it's like to be on the battlefront, but also what it's like to be on the home front on the rural Illinois prairie during the war.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's one aspect about this book that has me excited, has a lot of people excited, in that there are other edited collections of letters. It's certainly better to find letters where you have both ends of the correspondence. But in this case, we're meeting two people who are deeply anti-war, deeply anti-Lincoln,
That's right.
and people who are very comfortable with language that we are very uncomfortable with. Can you contextualize who the standards are in terms of their anti-war copperhead, what we call copperhead attitudes toward the war?
Yeah, I think what we're learning now about the Civil War in the North was that the North was much more complicated, much more complex politically and culturally than previous scholars had thought about. The standards are originally from the South. William from North Carolina, Jane from Tennessee. So they come and they settle among other Southerners in this kind of lower North, similar to what happened in Indiana, Ohio, Illinois. These would be Copperhead areas, people that meaning areas where there was resistance to the Union, resistance to the Lincoln administration, resistance to abolition among Northerners. They are, I think that they come across as people who are very skeptical of liberalism, meaning a kind of active federal government that is interested in changing the country dramatically, as happens over the course of the war. And they're very frank about this. They're not, I think one of the keys to understanding people like the Standards is because they're not part of high society, they are not as careful with their language. Of course, they're writing to each other. They don't really expect the letters to be published. But there's not only a coarseness, but an authenticity to the language they use. And they're very candid with each other about the fact that they don't like William being away. Jane is always imploring him to come back. He does his best to appease her. He's tempted to desert, something that I'm interested to get into in the book. But he remains a good soldier despite her pleas with him to come home and restore the family. It's a story about people caught in the middle of this epic change in America, and they resist this change. They're skeptical of why this fellow Illinoisan, Abraham Lincoln, would want to change the country so quickly. Mm-hmm. And they see him as a very dangerous character. They probably see Lincoln, maybe William does in 1858, when Lincoln comes and gives a speech in Canton. That's probably the first time they see Lincoln, and they probably recognize him, I think they're very shrewd people, as a troublemaker right away.
Okay, they see him as some of the Illinois people see him as a radical, as a troublemaker, in spite of what he says.
That's right. He's, at the time, of course, he's pledged not to interfere with slavery where it exists. He's simply, as a Republican, interested in limiting slavery's expansion. But even so, they're native Southerners, the Standards are. Their families come from the South. They're very much people who would have supported the Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas. And Douglas was the only national politician by 1860, partly because he appeals to Southern attitudes about black people. For Douglas and people like the Standards, America was a white man's country. And to interfere with this kind of social hierarchy was just disturbing and something that really rankled them, and they never really came to grips with it.
They did see it but they also saw it as something more than political and theoretical. Do you perceive personal threat of black people coming to Lewiston and settling and having to be our neighbors?
It's not that. You look at the census data, there's very, very few people, African American people in Illinois, generally, certainly not in the rural parts of downstate. So it's more of an existential kind of anxiety. It's the idea that the country is changing and the values of the country are changing that don't fit with their kind of traditional ways. It's very possible that William had never seen an African American until he goes to the South. There were very, very few black people. There was a free black community in Philadelphia, Illinois, that had been established back in the 1840s, but I'm pretty sure that William would have never encountered that. So it's an interesting how there's an anxiety and a strength, a virility to their fear, despite the fact that there's probably not very much risk that they're going to be living cheek by jowl with African Americans in their lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now they are they come across with this racist attitude, and they're also, in a lot of ways, war haters. At least they hate this war for their own personal reasons. And do you think that is an attitude that's? Do you think that's an attitude that's not accounted for by modern scholars of the Civil War? Or students of the Civil War. In 2017, do we think of being anti-war as being a liberal point of view? Whereas back then, here are two deeply conservative people who hate the war, and they seem to hate war, at least for what it does to them.
Yeah, I think in the modern era, certainly since maybe Vietnam, we think about people who are against war as being people for civil rights. Certainly the Civil War, the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in the 60s were linked in many ways. It's not like that here. The United States, the Union, the military, the government were certainly after 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation occurs, is committed to a vast liberal rights agenda, restarting the country, as some scholars have said, with the changes in the Constitution. This was only accomplished through military conquest, right? It becomes an army of abolition. Very reluctantly, William remains a part of that. But they are against the war precisely because they cannot come to grips. They have no categories for what the country could become, an era in which there is more racial equality. The great fear that Stephen Douglas built a career out of, was the mongrelization of the United States. Mm-hmm. And they never used those kind of terms, but I think that's always lurking behind their criticism of Lincoln, their criticism of Republican officers, their criticism of black Republicans, meaning white people who support the Republican Party in the neighborhood. They just don't understand the implications of where this war is taking the country, the North. And they're trying to put a halt to it as much as they can. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Now, why did William decide to enlist in 1862? I want to tell folks home, he does not rush to the recruiting center right after Fort Sumter. He joins in 1862. Does he tell us anything about why he decided to join this army?
It's the letters start really once he has enlisted in the fall of '62, but we can put together a little bit of background. He they were I would say they're fairly well-off people. They're not poor. They owned land. They had a farm. He had been a school teacher in the 1840s and then was sheriff in the 1850s. There was an economic downturn in the United States in 1857, so it's possible that he had run into some debts in that year. I came across some really interesting information in the archives, the special archives at Western Illinois University, where I teach, that suggest he had some real legal problems on the eve of the Civil War. So certainly William did not join in a great eruption of patriotism to go and do his duty as a patriotic Yankee. He probably joins the military for more complicated and in some ways more modern reasons. He's doing it for his family to make some income. He may be running away from some collectors at home, much to Jane's chagrin. She doesn't know about these creditors until after William has gone. As I say in the book, he never really tells us what he's fighting for. He tells us he's fighting against the rebellion. But he never really professes, this kind of liberal abolition Union sentiment that a lot of recent Civil War scholarship about the typical Union soldier have emphasized. It reminds us that there's a lot of complexity in the North, and that the Army that William joins, committed to ending slavery, but it's done by people like William. I call him a kind of reluctant abolitionist. He is coerced into doing it, and it's a testimony. At the same time, it's a testimony to his resistance, to the ability of the United States to coerce 2 million soldiers and ultimately serve to get done what the mission is to do, despite these personal foibles and politics of the standards.
Mm-hmm. Now, yeah, that's very interesting. He represents. I don't. Would you be able to guess a percentage of anti-administration soldiers? But it's close. It's got to be close to that 45% of the people that voted for.
That's right. Remarkably, 45% of the North voted against Lincoln in 1864. I don't know that many people were what we would call copperheads, actively resisting the war. But 20% of Fulton County people were Southerners, had come from the South, migrated to Southern Illinois, and probably others were children of Southern migrants. This is probably true not only, as I said, in Illinois, but in the kind of old Northwest states that had been carved out of the old Northwest Confederacy. There's been Jennifer Weber's written a nice book on the Copperheads, and I think she revises earlier scholarship that kind of diminished the significance of the Copperhead presence in the North during the Civil War, and it was much more broad, not only in places like Missouri, a border state, but also in the Union states like Illinois. There's some really harrowing tales that Jane writes William about provost marshals. These are Union officers sent back home to enforce the military draft, to make sure that soldiers who are called to duty do so. She's talking about provost officers being targeted for assassination. Not a friend, but an acquaintance of theirs has his horse shot while he's riding it. There are Union soldiers sent back to the county to occupy it, to make sure that law and order prevails. And it really peaks right after the Emancipation Proclamation in '63, but then it really continues almost until early 1865. Yeah. And there's this tension, there's this constant tension, not only at the home front, but also, and what's important to see is how their letters show how the home front shapes how soldiers think about the war at the battlefront. Mm-hmm. William is encouraged by this. She's saying, not only Jane, but others who write him, saying, there are people here who feel like you. This is a wrong war. We hope to get Lincoln defeated in '64. Do what you can.
Right. Yeah, William and Jane both wanted William out of the Army almost as soon as he got into it. They even discussed desertion.
That's right.
They thought he should. So what kind of schemes did they come up with? Were they serious schemes, or were these just two people that wanted to be together, wool gathering about how could you get home?
Yeah. Jane begins to encourage William to desert, certainly by early 1863. She hears from some source that if he will allow himself to be captured by Confederate guerrillas, that they will simply parole him and allow him to walk back home to her open arms. Now, of course, this is hopelessly naive. Probably by '63, Confederate guerrillas are either turning Union soldiers they capture over to POW camps or simply executing them. Right. So fortunately, in this case, William does not listen to Jane and desert. I think what mitigates against that for William is his sense of honor. If he were to go home, even though there's opposition, to be a shirker, to be labeled a shirker or a deserter is a badge of shame that you get the sense would be hard to live down. There is a scheme that he hatches, however, that if he can jump, he never really acts upon it, but he talks very interestingly about moving the whole family to California and sitting out the rest of the war. So there's these really interesting possible ways that they can deal with the distance. That, of course, he doesn't desert. He serves out his time. He's honorably discharged in '65. One of the interesting things I noticed is that he was most interested in desertion, I think most tempted when he was not engaged in offensive maneuver.
The campaign.
Yeah. His unit, I think partly because its political loyalties were questionable, was almost always until Missionary Ridge, when he sees his first combat, was kept at the back. And they were guarding the railroad line to the Union supply line from Confederate bushwhackers in the Vicksburg campaign. And so this is very tedious. They're sitting around very hot conditions in the South. They're having to kind of be vigilant. Sometimes they're guarding Confederate property, and this makes no sense to them. Why can't they just loot it? So this is the time he's most tempted. I think as the war goes along, as his unit is committed and takes part in the Atlanta campaign and the March to the Sea, he talks far less of desertion. Jane never really gives up on the idea. Not only does she occasionally said, have you thought about coming back again? She thinks even about trying to go visit him at the front, which is really quite remarkable. At one point, she teases him she's going to dress up like a man and come see him in drag. So but yeah, they muse about desertion, but Standard, I think because he's mature, because he realizes the risks of even if he makes it home, to his personal reputation, he becomes, at the end of the day, a reluctant good soldier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the regiment. Let's go ahead and bring the regiment out of the darkness. He belongs to the 103rd Illinois Regiment. Now,
that's right.
Did from these letters and from the other things that you read, could you say that the 103rd Regiment had any particular quality? Is this a Republican regiment? Is this a Democrat regiment? Does it really reflect Fulton County and the area that it comes from?
It does reflect, I think, the political rivalries that we know existed in the North and in places, especially like these border areas, like Illinois, Southern Illinois in particular, where I think a lot more Civil War scholarship recently is really reconsidering how many of these lower North states should really be treated as border states. Their loyalties are always uncertain.
And indeed, Lincoln should be considered a border state politician.
That's right, which really makes it interesting how he is able to maneuver that and get elected
exactly
in 1860. But yeah, the county, I believe, was very mixed. It seems to me that there were certainly the soldiers that William talks about that he camps with tended to be Democrats. But there's lots of Republican officers, and so that makes for a really interesting tension when he's complaining that he's taking off. He's getting orders from a Republican officer whose real motives are questionable. William complains, as do many Union soldiers. A chronic problem in the Union Army of getting paid. He has to go for many, many months without getting paid, and he blames this on the Republicans. It's simply a Republican conspiracy to bleed the white common soldier to death to free the black man. Jane lives in an area that is again divided. She one of the ways she makes income during the war is to have people. She rents out rooms, boarders, and one of the men that she rents a room to early in the war, about a year later, she writes William very suddenly. She says, "You're not going to believe what I've just found out, but Mr. So-and-so is a black Republican. I can't believe he's been living under my roof. What shall I do?" So there's this scandalous element. But at the same time, this is the complexity of the North. I think as you go further north in Illinois, it's more true blue Republican. But South, Springfield and South, there was a heavily Democratic legislature throughout the war in Illinois, very anti-war. At one point, the Republican governor of Illinois prorogues the legislature, basically suspends it. And we need to remember how divided Illinois, in our, our bicentennial, we need to remember how complex Illinois politics was at this time. And we need to understand the strength of this kind of conservatism that has flavored Illinois culture and Illinois people at this time and later.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Now, we're going to take a moment away from William and Jane, and as usual, here we are at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. That means the bookshop, from where you're watching this interview, has artifacts and letters and books, antiquarian books about the Civil War, the U.S. presidency, and President Abraham Lincoln. And we can share, on A House Divided, we can share these things with you. What we're going to share with you right now is a handbill, a sales bill for some patent medicine that was available in the Civil War, the Army Salve. The Army Salve. And as the folks at home can see, it is great for humor sores. So if you are out of humor, the Army Salve will help you with that. The creators, this particular version of small pharma, if you will, say that it has cured thousands of cases of the piles. The piles, of course, are hemorrhoids. This is a fine hemorrhoid medicine. And they even say, I like this one, they even say, it will almost cure them in one night. I don't think marketing has changed in 150 years, because anybody that reads that twice can know that to almost cure hemorrhoids is the same thing as not curing hemorrhoids. But this is a very interesting piece. It's an original handbill for patent medicine. And if you're interested in it, contact us at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, and we will talk about that. Not that this doesn't relate to William and Jane, but in some ways it does. We've talked thus far about William and Jane and their politics. Right. William and Jane are also very much in love.
Yes.
They're a good couple. They are good lovers. You've already hinted that she flirts with him. And so these are fun letters to read. These are not right. Just political letters, and they're not all just angry at Lincoln and hating on they both write well, and they're a good couple, and they also write frankly about their personal yes. Medical conditions. Right. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, and that's what's beautiful about this collection. It's a military history, but it's also a personal history, a cultural history, an intimate history of these people, very much committed to each other. And again, because they have a very close relationship, I think it's a very strong marriage they have before the war. They speak very frankly and intimately to each other. It was delightful to read of their letters sharing complaints about each of them suffering from a broken tooth, or when Jane tells William that fleas have infested her bosom. And there's these lovely, this is candor that gives the letters a real vitality and a real earthiness that helps us to understand, ordinary American life away from the battlefront, away from the centers of power during the Civil War. Jane was capable of being, as you said, racist, vulgar, crass, but she was also capable of being very coy and alluring. She writes a letter. I'm pretty sure it's written around the time of Valentine's, which is a holiday that had begun to be celebrated at the time. And there's a little bit, I think there's some sexual innuendo in this letter that is barely below the surface, and I'll let readers find out what the words she uses, and they can make their own interpretation of that. She does at times ask William if he has remained faithful to her, if he loves her, and he is. I think he remained loyal to her during the war. At the same time, he tells of other soldiers who are going to the red light district when the army is camped, and I think it's a way for him to show that he is not doing that. He's not being promiscuous. But it's also sharing some gossip, and that keeps her going. The gossip about the local people is something that helps her to connect with him and his world. And she says, "Oh, I'm not interested in that stuff, in those sorts of things. But tell me more about that if you get a chance." So there's this really nice. There's this candor and this kind of flirtiness that accompanies the aspect of letters as being simply war letters, that I think is really enjoyable.
We have a letter from We have a comment from the internet. Yes, we do have a letter from the internet. Emily Roberts has sat down to submit a question. You may have already answered this question. I don't know how long ago she did it, but Emily asks, how did they save her letters?
Interesting. And full confession, Emily Roberts almost certainly is my spouse who is tuned in.
I'll let you see the icon.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so
say hello.
It's really interesting. Hi, Emily. It's really one of the things I learned about in editing these letters is how Civil War soldiers and civilians communicated. This is a time before, obviously, modern infrastructure. The United States committed to trying to deliver the mail written to and from soldiers during the war. And it's interesting to see through William's comments how that functions. In addition to the regular mail service, there's a constant kind of process by which some soldiers are going home on furlough and returning. And once you learn that informal system, these soldiers who are going back to the community where Jane lives on furlough are able to deliver his letters. He apparently kept all of her letters that he received and then would return them when he would write her a letter. Otherwise, almost certainly her letters would have been destroyed. He's on the march in the Deep South, a lot of perspiration, a lot of dirt, a lot of blood.
They talk about preserving the letters in the letters.
Yeah. So probably that's the case. He's very, very diligent, not only in writing her, but preserving her letters and getting them back to her. And that's probably how we are able to see her letters today.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things we've already talked about a little bit, and you've expanded upon it, Civil War regiments were communities. The regiments were usually made up of men from communities, so the regiment is itself
That's right.
a community. And so how did existing personal and political relationships in the community in Fulton County carry over into the war? Did they? Did the men continue to be good comrades, or did they continue to have the same antipathies in the ranks?
I think in William's case, there were rivalries and peccadillos that had existed before the war between him and his family and other people in the community that were exacerbated in the ranks. For example, as I said, the Standards owned land and had to pay taxes on it. Something that appears to have been fairly common was others would attempt to pay a property tax with the possibility of getting the land from the landowner. And this made Jane very angry when this is going on. She's trying to learn all this stuff about how to manage the home, manage the property. A lot of these people that she feared were trying to, by hook or by crook, get a one leg up on them on the land that they owned at home, were in the ranks with William, as almost always Republicans. And I don't know if that it's probably fairly accurate that the people who had been their kind of social or kind of rivals or threats, even as Jane saw them, probably wound up being Republican members of his unit. It's probably the case that Republicans in his unit perhaps come from a little bit higher economic, social status back in Fulton County and the surrounding region. The Democrats in his area, or a good number of them may have been more foot soldiers and lower ranked officers. William starts as a sergeant, is promoted to lieutenant late in the war. The family rivalries in rural Illinois become transformed probably into more political rivalries and magnified even. William begins to question the real purposes of these Union officers who are corrupt and incompetent and ordering men into dangerous missions, and he can't really understand the reason. Why is there so much difficulty in carrying out an order? Why is there so much effort being expended again to free the slaves? We're putting the white man in harm's way. And it complicates his world in terms of what he's fighting for. And it certainly must complicate his motivation to continue to follow orders.
Yeah.
At the same time, he invokes Lincoln a lot. He's saying, I sleep on Lincoln beds, and I see Lincoln men wearing Lincoln uniforms. And so Lincoln's kind of, Lincoln comes across as a kind of big brother presence. He cannot escape from the man in Washington who has brought all this on him, being personified, though, in the person of these Republican officers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, mostly so far we've talked about the first phase of William's service, which, as you said, was mostly in camp, garrison, guarding,
right,
guarding the rear areas, possibly because of some of the political leanings of the members of the regiment.
Right.
We could surmise about that. But one thing I want to comment on is that I've read thousands, no, not thousands, I've read hundreds of collections of letters. I've read a lot of diaries. And I've also read a lot of people scholars commenting on diaries. And some of the comments I've seen, they come from a previous generation, before I want to qualify that, say, these letters are boring. There's no battles. This guy belongs to a boring regiment. They weren't at Gettysburg. He doesn't write a lot about Little Round Top or anything like that. But one of the things, the more you read these, the more you come to understand when soldiers are in battle, when soldiers are on campaign, they don't have a lot of time to write down their thoughts, to write long letters. When soldiers are bored, when soldiers are in camp, when soldiers wish they were somewhere else, they take pen to paper and they write long, fulsome letters about what they feel. So in contrast to what stuff I heard in previous generations, why would anybody publish these letters 50 years ago? They're not exciting. He's not at Shiloh. He's not fighting at Vicksburg. Instead, he's writing long letters about the meaning of the war, his opposition to the war, his love for his wife. Jane is responding in kind. They're actually incredibly exciting. They're a really great read.
Yeah, and I think the fact that there is interest now, the Kent State Press what saw the value of these letters. It shows us how what we are interested in about the Civil War changes from generation to generation. There is excitement, there is passion, there is conflict we can learn about the war from these letters.
It's a dramatic read.
It's a dramatic read.
Dry political, yeah.
Yeah, it's a conversation spiced with references to things that we're familiar with, the battles and the places that William is on the campaign. William never really talks about what he does in battle. I kept looking for him to say, "I shot a man today," or we came across a Confederate and or a Reb, a Secesh, and I put him to the sword. He never says that. Does that mean he never killed anybody? I don't know. This is a very Victorian age, and it's a very religious era in which Civil War soldiers generally really struggled with orders to kill the enemy. Two Christian armies, largely fighting it out. But probably he did his duty. He's in the trenches at Atlanta. He's fighting at Missionary Ridge. And he certainly did nothing to, as far as we know, that caused other people to see him as a shirker or as somebody who disobeyed orders. But at the same time, because of his unit's assignment to support others, he has the time to document what it was like, perhaps away from the battlefront. And for this week, it really gives us much more of a sense of what most of what soldiers did during the war was like. Fighting was a very small part of the time that you spent in the ranks.
But the 103rd Illinois did assemble a fine and honorable combat record.
That's right.
They became a frontline combat regiment, and you've referred to it already. That happens in the summer of 1864. They go on Sherman's Atlanta campaign. Does William tell us anything about either his combat experience or the way his attitude toward the war either changes or stays the same in the face of active campaigning?
Yeah, I think that's really when he's transformed. He becomes a hardened, devoted soldier, I think, for the first time in the summer of '64 when they leave Tennessee. He had speculated that they were going to go to Kentucky and do something else, but instead, as we see what's revealed, as he joins what will become the Atlanta campaign, and he gives a very, very detailed, blow-by-blow account of the approach to Atlanta, and he has a fairly accurate view of not only what his army is doing, but what the Southern Army is doing too. This kind of cat and mouse. As Sherman would advance, the Confederate defenders under Johnson would kind of scurry around, and it was a matter of trying to outflank each other all the way to the city. And so there's some really interesting information about the tactics of the armies and how much soldiers could detect what was going on. He really, for the first time, talks about the slaughter of the Confederates. There were young boys and older men by the summer of '64. Around the Battle of Atlanta, they're being thrown out there, and they were cut to pieces. And in pretty graphic detail, he, among others, Charles Wills, talks about cutting down the enemy like grass. And so you really get a sense of when he had been very, probably, I think, reticent to talk about what he was seeing before. I think what he's witnessing in Atlanta and in the march especially when the Battle of Atlanta is so graphic that it comes out. And you get a sense of what it was like to be at the front, to be in the trenches, and to see the destruction. He's carrying out his duty. He never really says, I see what we're doing with the war. He does begin to talk more and more about Sherman. He begins to praise Sherman. He said, Sherman is the greatest general. Sherman is going to win this war for us. And he believes that under Sherman's guidance, who can finally, as a competent Union general who can get all the army going in the same direction, that will enable the war to end and for him to be able to return home.
Right. And we could go on about Sherman because Sherman seems like Will's kind of guy, a conservative,
That's right.
loyal general.
That's right.
We have one more question before I have something I want to show, but I have one more question from the internet. So we have a lot of people watching today, but Sumner has a question.
Okay.
And wants to know, how long would it take for a letter to be delivered from William to Jane or vice versa?
That's a good question by Sumner Roberts. Hi, Sumner. It varied, but I think that it's possible. It's really interesting to see because you can see because they'll date the letter, and then in that letter they'll say, "Oh, I received your letter of this date." It could take generally about a week to 2 weeks. It varied depending on where he was. The further south he went, it took longer. But it's remarkable how much of a kind of regular communication the Union Army was able to sustain, either informally, as I said, or formally. William wrote about one letter a week during the war, during the entire war. Jane wrote letters about every 2 weeks. So this is a remarkable commitment to communicating with each other. It shows faith in each other, but also a faith that the letter is going to be delivered.
Yeah. Although there are times, especially when he's bored and angry in West Tennessee and he doesn't get letters for a long time, when he starts to wonder if somebody is keeping the letters away from him.
Yeah. And of course, Republican officers under orders of the generals began to censor some of the mail, some of the newspapers that are being circulated among the troops. There's a Democratic press in Fulton County that's virulently anti-Lincoln. And he talks about those newspapers never arriving. So yeah, he's very suspicious of why he can't get communication. He doesn't really blame Jane. He believes that she's devoted. He again falls back on this idea that the Republican officers don't know what they're doing, or they're intentionally denying the mail to be delivered. So there's always the political element, again, that he always sees what's going on through the lens of this political culture that connects both, again, what's going on at home and what's going on in the ranks.
Right. Hey, we have another thing to share, and you mentioned it already. Charles Wills, the 103rd Illinois Regiment, is not an unknown regiment. There were some heroes. And they got written about. And they sat down, the veterans sat down and published books. And this one is Charles Wills, Army Life of an Illinois Soldier. There you see right there, it's a beautiful copy of it. 1906 is when this was published. Right there on the front is that yellow diamond with the cartridge box, the symbol of the 15th Army Corps. And I know you read this. You used this to help interpret the book,
right?
And I want your comment on that. And there was also another published collection of diaries at some point that was, but I guess my question about it, when these guys published these books later, how do their attitudes compare with the here and now attitudes of William Standard when he's writing during the war? In other words, when you look at the 103rd Illinois in 1906, do they really look like the same guys as they were in 1864?
That's complicated. Wills is a Republican, and he's very much more. He's skeptical.
Charles Wills.
Charles Wills.
Not Will Standard. Yeah.
No, Charles Wills, like William, is very skeptical about the Union's decision.
Tim, we were talking about William coming out of the campaign for Atlanta, and I wanted to introduce a new topic because it's a really interesting topic for these guys. We've spent the entire time, 55 minutes so far, talking about their opposition to the war and their opposition to abolition, opposition to emancipation, and then William starts to talk about seeking a commission to become an officer in the Department of United States Colored Troops.
That's right. Yeah, after the Emancipation Proclamation, these units are created, U.S. colored troop regiments, officered by almost always officered by white officers, but an opportunity for both African Americans, former slave and free black, to join the U.S. military. Obviously made famous in the film Glory at the Massachusetts 54th. William talks about this, strangely enough. He asks Jane what she thinks about the possibility for him to accept a commission, and she has mixed emotions. She obviously, I think, would like for him to come home, and for that reason, she would like to tell him, I would really love for you to not go that route. On the other hand, she says, do what you think is best. If you think it would, help you, be in a position of safety, or if it'll get more pay, pursue it. What's clear is he did not become an abolitionist and a kind of enlightened officer like Robert Gould Shaw to give black men a fighting chance. He does it for very expedient reasons. He probably more characteristic of officers who lead these black troops, does so for career reasons, for purposes of seeing a different aspect of the war, for more pay. He was going to get a substantial pay raise to do it. He doesn't take it. He decides to write it out with the 103rd. And again, it's a surprise in the letters, a detour that kind of comes from you and go, wow, this guy really is much more complex. It's difficult to stereotype a guy like William Standard as a low-level Union officer trying to make it through the war, but also entertaining sometimes some surprising ideas of where his career might take him.
Right. One last question, because we need to wrap up here in a minute, but we have one last question from Zoe Roberts. Did William ever recant his beliefs about the Union? Did he ever turn around on his fundamental core value?
It's interesting.
Thank you, Zoe.
He uses, hi Zoe. He uses, as we said, both of them used a lot of racial epithets during the war, throughout the war. And then after the war ends, he, along with the Army of the West, goes to Washington, D.C. to participate in the Grand Review, this 2-day kind of Roman-like procession of the armies through the streets of Washington to salute the president. And thousands of people come and cheer. The Army of the West, the men like Westerners like William, they believe that they have won the war. There's lots of rivalry even then. There's fistfights between the soldiers of the Army of the West and the Army of Northern Virginia. The soldiers like William called the Virginians featherbed soldiers. But I think caught up in the kind of euphoria and the spectacle of it all, he makes one comment. He says, everyone was cheering for us, young and old, black and white. They're all cheering for the conquering soldiers who have brought peace back to the Union, the greatest army in the world. It's really the only time that he doesn't, when he's talking about people of color, using an epithet. I don't really know if he has that kind of different mindset carry over into his life after the war. I doubt it very much. Again, he goes back, and I think Fulton County doesn't undergo the kind of social change that happens elsewhere in the North after the war. Again, though, he becomes a dedicated soldier. He becomes a committed, a reliable soldier capable of being promoted by the Army at the end. It's something he covets very much, and he does is discharged from the Army in the summer of '65 with honors, and he goes back home alive, and able to embrace Jane, which is really what they're all devoted to trying to get accomplished right from the beginning. So it's I think but I think in general his racial attitudes are intact during the war and after the war. He remains a kind of crusty, old Union conservative that will actually shape the politics of that part of Illinois really until the 20th century. It's not until 1896 that Fulton County will vote for a Republican president. So it's the political animosities before the war continue in that part
So he
of Finland.
continues to reflect his community,
That's
or at
right.
least that part of his community.
That's right.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to take a few minutes and tell you what's coming up on Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. The upcoming shows, the next one, Lit with Love, Sonali Dave, February 9th at 3 p.m. With Fulgani Kothari, her latest, My Last Love Story. After that, Solved with Libby Hellman is back on February 22nd at 3 p.m. with Melanie Benjamin's The Girls in the Picture. And then the next one after that is Solved again, and this is a special one. You're going to want to put this on your calendar. This is a get. On March 16th, Solved is back, featuring the best-selling author Jeffrey Deaver's latest, The Burial Hour. The Burial Hour by Jeffrey Deaver. That's going to be great. You're going to want a signed copy of that. That will be March 16th at 3 p.m. Ask a question, order a signed copy at authorsvoice.net. If you're on the website, that's where you're watching us. And if you're watching this on YouTube after the event is over, we still have signed books. There's going to be a link there. You click on it, you order the book, it's signed, we'll ship it out to you. That is, of course, going to be the case with This Infernal War, the Civil War letters of William and Jane Standard. It is from Kent State University Press. It costs $38.95, and it will be available signed after the event is over. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you can still get a signed copy. Thank you to Kent State University Press and the good folks there for helping get Tim to us. And then thank you to Timothy Mason Roberts for joining us today. And thank you to you at home. Good afternoon and good evening from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop and Author's Voice.